The stone trembled under his boots. Another cannonball smashed into the bastion, spraying dust and shattered limestone across the parapet. A knight in a blood-stained tunic pulled his visor shut, not for protection, but to hide the terror in his eyes. Around him, men who had sworn oaths to God and the order were clawing at the rubble, trying to reach a comrade buried beneath the collapse. Someone was screaming in Italian, someone else was vomiting, and beyond the wall, the largest fleet the Mediterranean had ever seen stretched from horizon to horizon, disgorging an army of 40,000 onto the parched soil of Malta. It was late May, 1565. The Ottoman Empire had come to erase the knights. Hospitaller from the earth, Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of the greatest military machine on the planet, wanted this tiny archipelago as a stepping stone to invade Europe itself. Against him stood just 500 knights, perhaps 8,000 soldiers and Maltese militia, and a collection of dusty forts that seemed laughably weak. The main fortress, Fort St. Elmo, sat on a rocky peninsula like a wounded animal waiting for the kill. Every commander in Europe had already written the order's obituary, but the knights made a decision that defied all logic. Instead of massing inside the larger defensive positions, they chose to sacrifice a small garrison at St. Elmo, deliberately, coldly, to bleed the Ottoman army one man at a time. They sent in volunteers, men who knew they would never walk out alive. That decision turned a certain slaughter into a brutal calculus. How many attackers could a handful of dying men drag into the grave with them? The immediate consequence was a siege within a siege. For 33 days, the defenders of St. Elmo watched the Ottoman cannons reduce their walls to gravel. They fought from rubble, used fallen beams as barricades, and drank water that turned red with blood. Turkish janissaries climbed the slopes 3 times a day, only to be hacked back down with halberds and boiling pitch. The knights didn't just hold, they turned every breach into a meat grinder. By mid-June, the Ottoman commander, Mustafa Pasha, had lost 4,000 men and still hadn't taken the fort. His soldiers began to whisper that the Christian walls were cursed. Then came the new complication. On the night of June 23rd, a message swam across the bay under cover of darkness. Reinforcements from Sicily were weeks away, and the order's Grand Master had no more men to send. The garrison of St. Elmo was down to 60 wounded survivors. Their powder was gone. Their commander, a French knight named de Giral, stood on the last undamaged section of wall and watched the entire Ottoman army form up for a final assault. No relief would come. No miracle was waiting. And yet, when a messenger offered terms of surrender, safe passage, gold, even command of a Turkish province, the knights spat on the letter. They picked up their broken swords. They waited for dawn. He pressed his palm against the clay jar and felt the dry heat of the desert seep through the ceramic. Inside, names had been scratched, lots for the final duty. One man would kill the others, then himself. No Roman sword would touch their bodies. Around him, the wind carried whispers from the base of the mountain, where 15,000 legionaries hammered stones into a ramp that climbed toward the sky. The siege of Masada had lasted 3 years, but tonight the end had a smell: dust, sweat, and the bitter almond of poison hidden beneath cloaks. The year was 73 AD. Nearly 1,000 Jewish rebels, men, women, and children, had held the fortress of Masada since the fall of Jerusalem. King Herod's ancient mountain palace, perched on a rock plateau in the Judean desert, seemed impossible to take. Cliffs dropped 400 meters on every side. The only approach was the snake path, a narrow ledge where even a handful of defenders could roll boulders onto an advancing army. The Roman governor Flavius Silva had been patient. He built a wall around the entire mountain to starve them out. Then he ordered his 10th Legion to build something no one believed possible: a massive earthen ramp against the western cliff, stone by stone, day by day, while archers shot anyone who leaned over the parapet to interfere. The rebels' decision came slowly, then all at once. Their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, gathered everyone in the cold dawn. He argued not for surrender, but for freedom, the kind that Romans could not take. No chains, no slave markets, no triumph in the streets of Rome. The consequence of that decision would echo for 2,000 years. They set fire to every building except the storehouses, so the Romans would know they died of choice, not hunger. Then the fathers kissed their children. Husbands held their wives, and in the darkness before the final breach, they drew lots. Here is where historians debate. Some sources say the Romans broke through the next morning to find silence and bodies neatly laid out. Others describe a single woman and 5 children who hid in a cistern, and later told the story to Roman scribes. The record is unclear about exactly how many died, by their own hands versus the enemies. What is certain is that when the Legionaries climbed over the shattered wall. Expecting to spill blood for their emperor, they found no one to fight. No defiance, no pleas. Just 900 people who had turned Masada from a fortress into a tomb. But the new complication arrived not from the mountain, but from the empire's reaction. Rome had won, technically. The province was pacified. The last Jewish resistance was crushed. Yet Flavius Silva did not celebrate. He stared at the bodies for a long time, then ordered his men to build a new camp, as if the siege might resume. The Roman army had been trained to conquer, not to find empty walls. And across the empire, the story of Masada began to spread not as a victory, but as a question. Could any army truly defeat people who refused to be captured? The rebels had not won the battle. They had stolen the Romans' triumph. And as the legionaries dragged their siege engines back to Caesarea, one thought followed them like the desert wind. What other mountains still held? Men willing to burn everything. Rather than kneel? The lookout's whisper cracked like dry wood. Below, the Seine had turned black with dragon-headed longships, so many that the water seemed to disappear beneath them. A young Frankish knight named Odo, son of the Count of Paris, pressed his forehead against the damp stone of the bridge tower and counted. 40,000 Norsemen. Maybe more. They had already burned Rouen. They had sacked Chartres. Now they wanted the heart of West Francia itself, the fortified island city of Paris, straddling the Seine like a stone ship. The year was 885 AD. A brutal winter was coming, and the Viking chieftain Siegfried had made his demand clear: pay tribute or die. But Paris had no army. The king, Charles the Fat, was hundreds of miles away, feasting and arguing with his nobles. Inside the city walls, fewer than 200 fighting. Men stood ready, mostly militia, with rusty spears and a handful of professional knights led by Odo and his brother, Robert. The bridges over the Seine were the city's only defense. 2 wooden crossings, chained and fortified with towers, that gave the defenders a narrow killing field. The decision came at dawn on November 25th. Instead of hiding behind their walls, Odo ordered his best archers to the bridge towers and launched a volley into the first wave of Viking longboats. It was a provocation, a slap meant to draw the enemy into the narrowest possible approach. The consequence was immediate and horrific. Siegfried threw his berserkers at the northern bridge, men foaming at the mouth, screaming for Odin. The Franks dropped boiling oil, then pitch, then burning hay. The wooden bridge caught fire. Viking corpses piled so high that later, chroniclers wrote of crossing the Seine on dead bodies. For 2 days, the Norsemen could not gain a single stone of the city. But the escalations came in waves. On the 3rd night, Siegfried changed tactics. He dragged 3 longships overland around the city walls, a feat of brutal manpower, and attacked the undefended southern bridge. Odo raced his men across the island in darkness, fighting hand-to-hand on planks slick with ice and blood. He took an axe to the head that split his helm. He kept fighting. The chronicles say he held the southern tower alone for an hour, shield shattered, sword notched, while his men rallied behind him. The complication arrived with the snow. By December, the Vikings had stopped trying to storm the bridges. Instead, they built camps around Paris and settled in for a siege. Inside the walls, hunger became the real enemy. The defenders ate horses, then dogs, then rats, then the leather from their own shields. Disease crawled through the alleys. One by one, the original 200 men dwindled to 60, then 40, then a handful of walking skeletons. Odo sent desperate messages to the king, begging for relief. No answer came. And through the winter wind, the Norsemen began building something new, a massive siege tower, taller than the walls, wheeled on logs, designed to roll across the frozen Seine and end everything. The wheel groaned against the ice like an animal in pain. 80 feet of oak and iron, covered in wet hides, rolling forward inch by inch while archers behind it poured arrows over the top. Inside Paris, the surviving defenders watched from the shattered southern tower. 47 men, most wounded, no arrows left, no oil, no hope. The Viking war horn sounded once, then again, a low note that vibrated through the frozen river and into their very bones. Siegfried was finished waiting. His tower would reach the wall before noon, and when it did, 40,000 Norsemen would follow. It was January 886 AD, and Paris had become a tomb waiting to be sealed. The city's women had already burned their own furniture for warmth. Children cried from hunger so deep that their voices had gone silent. Odo of Paris, now barely able to stand from an infected wound in his thigh, had one decision left: surrender and beg or die fighting. Every sane calculation said surrender. No relief was coming. King Charles the Fat had finally replied, not with soldiers, but with a promise to negotiate. Negotiate. Odo crushed the letter in his fist. The king would pay tribute. The Vikings would sail away, and Paris would live. But as a humiliated city that had bought its survival with silver, Odo refused. He gathered his remaining men in the chapel of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. No speeches, no prayers that anyone could remember later. He simply drew his sword, the same blade that had split Viking helms for 3 months, and walked toward the southern bridge. One by one his knights followed, then the militia, then the old men who had been hiding in the cellars. 47 against an army. The immediate consequence was not a battle. It was something stranger. When Odo stepped onto the ice, alone, walking toward the siege tower, the Norse advance paused. Siegfried himself came to the front, curious. This was no longer war. This was a challenge. Odo stopped 50 paces from the tower, raised his visor, and shouted across the frozen air, "You will not take this city while I live. If you want it, come and take it from my hands." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Siegfried laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that carried across the river. He turned to his jarls and spoke in Norse. The chroniclers disagree on his exact words, but the meaning was clear. This Frank was worth more alive than dead. The king would pay ransom. The city would survive. And Paris would remember the man who stood alone on the ice. The new complication came not from the Vikings, but from the king. When Charles the Fat finally arrived, he did not fight. He paid Siegfried 700 pounds of silver to lift the siege, a betrayal that made Odo's defiance meaningless in the eyes of the court. The Norsemen sailed away, rich and laughing. Paris was saved, but humiliated, and Odo, the hero of the bridges, was denied even a public thanks. Yet history is written by survivors. Within 2 years, the people of Paris rebelled against the coward king. They threw off Charles the Fat and elected Odo as their new ruler, the first king of West. Francia not born to the throne. The Viking siege had broken the old order forever. And when the Norsemen returned a generation later, they found a city with stone walls, standing armies, and a king who knew exactly how to fight. The 47 starving men on the southern bridge had bought something more precious than survival. They had bought time, and that time became a kingdom.